Welcome to the GS Podcast. I'm Stephen Knight. Hope you're all good. It's a late one. First one of September, in fact. I've been a busy bee. I was at the Minds IRL conference, end of August, beginning of the month. And that was in New Jersey, America. And it was great. These amazing conversations, wonderful vibe, and the usual left-wing lunacy and controversy surrounding it. So, yeah, I moderated 3 panels, some great discussion, and they should be available online at some point, so I'll be sure to share them around. I'll probably go into more detail about the event at some point and maybe put a video together if I can find the time, or mention it on the next Taking the Myth, which I am committed to getting out in September. Me and Iram are trying to work out a time when we're both free. We're just very important people, basically. You don't know how lucky you are that we sit down and talk nonsense for an hour. You're welcome. This is a very good episode. I'll be speaking to Jeffrey Munn. Jeffrey Munn is responsible for a really interesting and very helpful book, in fact. It's called Staying Sober Without God, The Practical 12 Steps to Long-Term Recovery from Alcoholism and Addictions. Now, many of you may not be aware, maybe some of you are, the 12-step program, popularised by Alcoholics Anonymous, is generally considered the go-to treatment if you're suffering from addictions and specifically alcoholism. That's what it's synonymous with, of course. Not many of you might know that it has a very spiritual focus. It asks you to give yourself up to a higher power, aka God. It's very God-centric. And obviously, alcoholism doesn't discriminate as far as I'm aware. It gets the godly and it gets the non-believing heathens as well. So a lot of those people suffering with addiction kind of wondering where are they going to go? Where's their help going to come from? How can they get on board with this 12-step program when it's asking you to give yourself up to a power that they don't believe in? So it's great that people like Jeffrey are writing books on this topic. Right? We always seem to forget that the godly got a massive head start on culture and society and the law in general for centuries. So a lot of help groups, a lot of systems still have I was going to say hangover, probably not the best term to use here, but they still have them remnants of God and religious privilege hanging over them. So Jeffrey's helping to contribute to a more even playing field in that respect. It's more helpful, it's more of a compassionate focus. So he's wrote this wonderful book which interprets the 12-step program from a secular perspective, shall we say. It's not necessarily atheistic, because this approach would also work for believers as well. So I actually think he's improved it in a number of key ways. So he'll be speaking to me about that at length on the show. So if you've enjoyed hearing from Jeff, you can find him on Twitter at Jeff_MFT, Mike Foxtrot Tango. And I'm sure I'll be happy to hear from you, answer any of your follow-up questions. A reminder, I don't pimp out my PayPal and Patreon enough. I'm not a marketer. I'm useless at that kind of thing. Actually, it's probably why I'm still poor. But I don't do this full time. I do this in my spare time as a passion away from my normal 9-to-5 job. So if you'd like more content from me, if you'd like me to do this full time, it's in your hands. You can support the show by visiting gspellchecker.com/support, and you can give as little as you want a month or as much as you want a month. And eventually, if I'm lucky, that may be enough to buy food and pay the mortgage, and then I can just knock out 1 million podcasts a week, and then you'll be sorry. So there you go, gspellchecker.com/support. Enjoy.
There's a word that some folks find real hard to spell. Ain't it horrible for me, except after seeing who cared to go burn in hell? But then along came a man, a spell checker from the God of creed, and he set out upon a noble quest to help those that don't know what it means. And he said, go ATHGIST, and don't you put that I before that E. ATHGIST, don't mean we
I'm very pleased to welcome Jeffrey Munn to the podcast. Jeffrey, how are you doing?
Doing well, thank you.
Excellent. It's a really good topic, this, for my podcast. The first, in fact, it's something I've actually thought about a little bit in terms of the impact of alcohol on society, the way it's sort of normalized. It's part of our fabric. We talk about it in terms of friendship, really. You know, we should meet up and go for a drink is a common refrain, and it seems very ingrained. And I don't think the harm that it really does when sort of taken to its excesses is really fully appreciated by wider society. And you've wrote this excellent book, which I'm still working through, which is called Staying Sober Without God, and it sort of deals with the 12-step program and the difficulties people may have with that because of the quite prominent God element involved. So I'm really looking forward to picking your brains on that. Before I do, maybe you could just tell my listeners a little bit about your background. How would you describe what you do?
I am a licensed marriage and family therapist in the state of California, and also a recovering addict myself with about 13 years of sobriety, recovery from alcohol and various substances. And I went into treatment and got sober, and treatment was such a revolutionary thing for me that I decided to become a therapist myself. And I got a unique opportunity to see both kind of the two, not necessarily opposing, but two different sides to recovery. One being more the psychological therapy-based approach, and one being the more spiritual 12-step based approach. So I got to experience both of those things at the same time. And it showed me what they had in common and what was different. And I felt like there was enough in common that it was possible to create sort of a hybrid approach that was very down to earth, did not involve belief in anything supernatural, focused on psychology and human behavior and practical principles, and still was effective at getting people sober and keeping them sober.
Yeah, I mean, in your book as well, you talk about the term addiction and how really in isolation it's not all that helpful as a descriptor. It can mean a fair few things, or people often assume it means just one particular thing and wouldn't count their own behaviours under that umbrella of addiction. And I just wondering, maybe you could take a moment to first explain how you would define addiction. When would you class something as an addiction? And at what point did you realise personally that you had a problem with addiction?
That's a good question. I think it's really important to not look at the drug or the behavior itself when we're talking about addiction. You'll hear a lot of people say things like, oh, marijuana isn't addictive, or this isn't addictive, or sex addiction isn't real. And the problem with that is it's not about the act itself. It's about our relationship to it. You know, if someone is out there and they just love brown mustard so much that they can't stop buying it, and it's creating problems in their family life and their personal life, then that person has a problem with brown mustard. What matters is your relationship to it. And people who are addicted will tell you that they have this experience of not being able to stop something by themselves. That's all I really call an addiction. That's all I really think it is. So I think it's also important to understand that addiction is on a spectrum. It's not one or the other. It's not, am I an addict or am I not an addict? There's a spectrum of addiction. There are some people that are so profoundly addicted to their substance or their behavior that they will need a great deal of help beyond social programs like 12 steps. You know, they'll need medication. They may need intensive psychotherapy. And then there are some people who are low enough on the addiction spectrum that with just a little extra help, maybe from some meetings, they can get better.
Yeah. So, I mean, at what point did you realize that the issues you were having went beyond the scope of something manageable or something that wouldn't be classed as an addiction per se?
So I just noticed that I couldn't stop. And of course, to notice that, you have to want to stop. There has to be some sort of moment in one's addiction where they decide, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want these consequences. The severity of the consequences are outweighing the benefit. And so I want to stop. And then they will try, using various methods and fail. And if you've ever had that experience, which is the experience that I had, then, you fall somewhere on the addiction spectrum. And that happened with me. I would find myself driving to my drug dealer's house and trying to will myself to turn around and telling myself, I know I don't want to go here. I know I don't want to go through this again, but I couldn't stop. And I had run out of ideas. And that's when I really decided, okay, I'm hooked. I'm in this cycle and I need help.
Yeah, I mean, keeping on the topic of addiction and the definitions for a moment, and I know you do touch on this on your book, but there's often that common refrain, and it's often propagated as part of treatment as well in various places, that sort of once an addict, always an addict. Even if you're not using anymore, it's something that you will carry with you for the rest of your life. And how do you feel about that way of thinking towards addiction?
I think it's an interesting concept, and one thing you'll realize about me, and especially if you read my book, is I'm a big fan of nuance. I'm very rarely using absolute terms or saying, something is always this way or never this way. Life just doesn't seem to work that way. It also depends on how you're defining an addict. Some people define an addict as someone who's actively using a certain drug or actively engaged in a certain behavior. And if that's the case, then obviously, no, I don't think that once you're an addict, you're always an addict. I think what people are asking, though, when they ask that question is, will I ever be able to go back to using things normally, using alcohol normally, using, weed normally? And the answer to that, as is the answer to most questions from me, is it depends. It really depends. Some people, if they've had a severe enough addiction to something, they pretty much need to stay away from it for the rest of their lives. But then you look at things like behavioral addictions, such as people who overeat or people who are addicted to sex, things like that, pornography, things like that. We don't necessarily say that, we're not going to tell you to stop eating. So you do need to find some balance. So for them, it's also not black and white. It's not just you can either use this thing or you can't. They actually have to find a balance, which can be very difficult. Really depends on the addiction, and it really depends on the person. And that's something that I think is missing from, most people's understanding of addiction, is just how individualized it is and how many different forms of it there are.
So your book takes the approach of actually, in essence, sticking with the 12-step program, but tweaking it and improving it, I would say, in many areas in order to sort of secularize it and remove any sort of mysticism or woo-woo from it. And maybe before we get into the details surrounding what you've done there, maybe you could just explain to my listeners, if they're not aware, what the 12 Steps program actually is in its original form.
So the 12 Steps were developed originally by a guy named Bill W., and he created Alcoholics Anonymous along with his fellow sober friend, Dr. Bob. And, the 12 Steps aren't necessarily new ideas in and of themselves. It's just the way they were packaged. That was new, and the way that they were packaged to specifically address alcoholism. And the idea is that these are 12 steps that can result in someone having what they refer to as a spiritual awakening, which then causes them to no longer feel the desire to use or drink. And that's basically what it is. And these 12 steps go through a variety of different areas of human life. They go from, kind of our internal life. What do we know about what we're going through? Admitting that we have a problem, believing that the problem can be solved. Then it focuses on our relationship to other people. And then it focuses on a relationship to something greater than ourselves, which is most often referred to as God or a higher power in the traditional program.
Yeah, and in your book, you actually go a step further in a sense. Not only do you sort of eradicate these elements in your own 12-step program, but you'll also describe the faith-based aspect of it and the inclusion of God as potentially harmful. So I was just wondering, what are some of the ways that infusing this recovery program with the idea of an omnipotent being can be harmful to the patients in recovery?
Right. Well, I'm of the belief that there's really never a benefit from there's never a benefit that we get from fooling ourselves, from being out of touch with what is real. And, I believe that there are reality-based ways to look at this, and by doing that, we're more likely to have a more profound, more complete, more stable sense of recovery. I'll give you an example. So, when I first got into the 12-step world, I really wanted to give the God thing a try. I was atheist, but I was so desperate at the time. I was leaning more on the fence of agnosticism, and I was like, okay, I'll give this a try. People are swearing by it. They say, if you seek God, you will get X, Y, and Z. So you know what? I'll give it a try. And I really did. And I found that there was a lack of results. It just wasn't working for me. And I think that a lot of people fool themselves into thinking that it's working for them. And when they do that, I think there's more of a chance that they can be let down and be disappointed and be disillusioned by the whole process. If you're told that every time that if you pray enough, the obsession to use will be removed, and then you go home and you pray and you pray and you pray, and you still have the obsession to use or get high, that's pretty. That's a bummer.
Yeah.
And that causes people to really, I think, become disillusioned with the program, feel hopeless, and sometimes not come back. And sometimes they go out and they drink, and that's the end of it, and they die. Or they spend another 20 years drinking before they make it back to the program. So I'm not a fan of using any method that is not grounded in provable fact.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that point. But I did, however, just wonder what would happen, for instance, if somebody during the 12-step program did declare themselves an atheist. Would they be compelled to accept a creator or a higher power? Is there any alternative offered in that sense?
So it really, really depends on the culture of the local 12-step community. It depends on the 12-step group that you're in. So Alcoholics Anonymous is a little different from Narcotics Anonymous, is a little different from Overeaters Anonymous. They all have a different culture, and regionally they all have different cultures. So one good thing that I've noticed is that there is more room for atheists and agnostics in the 12-step program. But what they will still push is the concept of a higher power, your higher power. And they kind of make it like it needs to be this one thing. You need to have your higher power. And that never worked for me. I never understood that, because a higher power serves several different psychological purposes. And so rather than just trying to look for one higher power or God or something like that, I wanted to see all the things that the belief in God, all the functions that it was serving, and translate those into psychological principles and make it, more down to earth and have it make more sense. But, in a lot of meetings, people will be pushed. And I found that was my experience. I declared myself an atheist. I said, look, this God thing is not working for me. This one higher power, mystical, weird, nebulous definition of God you're telling me to create is not working for me either. Can we just talk like psychology, down to earth? What am I doing here, and how is it making me better? And I would get a lot of pushback. There were some people I could talk to about it, but most people would say, but you got to have a higher power, and just make your own higher power and come up with your own idea. And it just never made sense to me. It just felt like I was trying to shoehorn the concept of God or a higher power into my recovery when it just didn't fit.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about the structure of your book. You structured it in a very specific way, and obviously it's good information for those who are not addicts as well, and it's good information for those who are considering seeking help. So what was in your mind when you thought about the structure of your book?
I wanted my book to be something that a person in the 12-step program could still use. I wanted people to be able to use this in the 12-step program. I didn't want this to be something that told people to leave the 12-step program, because I believe there's a lot of benefit to being surrounded by other people that are trying to get sober. I think that's really important. So I wanted this to be something that fit into what they were already doing and didn't require them to completely change their recovery plan. So it follows the basic 12-step structure. It just changes the wording and changes the focus on a couple steps to make it, like I said, more down to earth and more practical. My book starts with just laying the groundwork about, what is recovery? What purposes does the belief in God serve? Because I truly believe that people who genuinely have faith in a higher power do receive benefit from that faith. There's no part of me in this book that's saying that, nobody should believe in God or nobody should take a faith-based approach. If that works, that's great. And I believe it does work for some people. But my question is then, why is it working? If we're going on the assumption that God does not exist, then what's actually happening? Because something's working, something's making them feel better. What's going on? So the beginning is kind of setting that groundwork and looking at what's really going on when people are having these spiritual experiences. Then the middle of the book goes through each step individually, talks about the step itself, gives the AA version of the step, and then gives my practical version of the step, explains why I made the changes, and then goes into how to actually do the work to do that step. And I end my book talking about things that I believe the 12 steps miss, or at least don't emphasize enough.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about this is as well, I suppose, yours is a very sort of empirical and pragmatist approach. And the great thing about it as well, I suppose, is that it'd work just as well, or maybe even better, for true believers too, to follow this rather than put their faith in a higher being or a God that's non-existent, wouldn't it?
I believe so. I've actually heard reports from some people who are believers who've read the book and found some benefit from it. Again, I'm not bashing anything. I'm not telling anyone to abandon any of their beliefs, but for the people who don't have a belief in a higher power, I believe this can help them. And even people who just want some extra down-to-earth advice and guidance that works well with their faith, yeah, I think it can work for them too.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on something a moment ago, which is really heavily emphasised in your book, and it's this idea of social interaction, face-to-face help, seeing people in person, whether it be a trusted individual or as a group. And I just wondered, what are the benefits of that? And I mean, I imagine it's probably at this day and age even more difficult to convince people to do with the proliferation of social media and digital modes of communication. But maybe you could just help us understand a little bit why this social aspect is very important to people who are sort of seeking help or recovery.
I think it just comes down to human nature. We are social creatures. We tend to act in a way that fits our circle of friends and our social circle. We tend to get our morals from the people that we surround ourselves with. So I just think it's important, if you want to become a great basketball player, you got to hang around a lot of basketball players. I mean, obviously it's a team sport, but if you want to become great at anything or get better at anything, you want to surround yourself with people who are doing that so you can get advice, you can have connections with other people, you can talk about it, figure out what you're doing right, what you're doing wrong. So I just think it's an essential part of just being a human. Is if we want to move in a certain direction, we need to find other people who are doing that as well.
Yeah, I suppose going back to my opening comments as well about the role of alcohol in society, it's a problem most places, but I think it's especially part of the social and cultural fabric of Great Britain. Everything social seems to revolve around that, from celebration to commiserations to just catching up with friends to letting off steam, and alcohol's fairly cheap. And I was wondering as well, in this idea of surrounding yourself with people who are healthy in order for some sort of inspiration. How do you manage, as someone who's an ex-addict, being in places like bars and parties and weddings, and where there's an expectation on you to imbibe alcohol?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. It's a question I get asked all the time. It's hard. It's hard, and it really depends on your level of stability in your recovery, how solid you're feeling. If someone is feeling like, I've kind of been craving a drink lately, it's probably not a good idea to go at all. It's probably a good idea to just talk to some people, that are in your support network and figure out, how do I get back on my feet and how do I get stable? Most people, though, over a period of time can occasionally go to a bar, weddings, things like that, and be okay. It's just a matter of being really honest with yourself, knowing what your escape plan is if things don't go well, and also just being very confident in your own recovery in terms of telling other people about it. Not that you have to disclose everything, not that you have to tell them your whole life story, but to be able to say very confidently to someone, "Oh, I don't drink." And if you really own that and just say that with confidence, not a lot of people are going to give you a hard time. Now, obviously, that depends on cultures. Some cultures are much more geared towards drinking than others. But for the most part, if you just keep saying, "Nope, I don't drink. Nope, nope, nope," and just stick to it, then eventually people are going to stop asking.
Yeah. And I just know in terms of my circle of friends, whenever somebody deciding that they're giving up alcohol for a while just to be healthier, they become the object of ridicule for the entire evening. And I think there's a strange mindset surrounding alcohol. I've sort of been trying to read a bit more on it recently about how it's advertised and how it's normalized and how that it's got a lot to answer for in terms of how much it costs in preventable diseases and admissions to accident and emergency every Friday evening. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on this in terms of how alcohol can be championed and celebrated, whereas other lesser narcotics could be demonized.
I think it ultimately comes down to just the fact that it's been something that's been accepted for such a long period of time. It's just so ingrained in culture that we, and it feels good. Alcohol works. Alcohol makes you feel better. It makes it easier to talk to people. It's fun. It's something you can all do as a community with other people. And so, it's just not something that we want to get rid of. We like it. We like our alcohol. And, I think we're seeing it a little bit more with marijuana right now, where people are just, the kind of demonization that used to happen is falling away, and people are realizing it's not black and white. It's not all bad or all good. And it's becoming more accepted. And, it's just, I think a lot of it is just that we're people who like what we like. And when we like something, we don't want to get rid of it.
Yeah.
And so we'll lie to ourselves and tell ourselves it's not that big of a deal, or it's not causing that many problems, or, we'll delude ourselves into whatever we need to believe so that we can continue doing what we like to do.
Okay. I mean, do you happen to know why the 12 Steps program became so infused with the religious aspects?
I'm not, I'm a little rusty on my AA history, so I don't know that I can give you the exact story, but I believe the 12 Steps, part of them came from a group, the Oxford group I know contributed to them, and then there was another group called the Washingtonians. And these groups also were just much more, they were religious, and they specifically focused on the relationship to God. So it was actually pretty revolutionary for the 12 Steps to step so far away from the idea of God. But, now we look at it and it doesn't look like a ton of progress to us. But for back in the day, this was actually pretty heathenistic. It was pretty heretical to be saying it's a higher power that you choose. So this was it was a big change to do that. So I think they did kind of the best that they could in that time. If they had gone from religious to completely non-religious, like I attempted to do in my book, I think it would have probably not done so well.
Yeah, and in terms of the 12 steps, which one of those steps did you kind of think this is the one that's in the most need of reform as far as God's concerned? Which one would you say you tweaked the most? Step 3
is we turned our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. And you can't there's nothing to hold on to there if you want to take an atheistic view of the steps. You kind of have to ditch everything. That the whole thing is about turning your will and your life over to God. So nothing secular in that step at all. And so I replaced it with committing to a lifestyle of recovery, focusing only on what we could control. Because I believe that's what people are doing when they're turning their will and their life over to the care of God. What they're really doing is letting go of control. I'm not going to try and control every aspect of my life that's outside of my control. I'm not going to try and control how people respond to me. I'm not going to try and control who likes me and who doesn't like me. I'm not going to try and control the outcome of this job interview. And you're turning your will and your life over to God, meaning that you're making a commitment. And so I just put those two things in a common sense, secular language, committed to a lifestyle of recovery, focusing only on what we could control. And it felt like just a more honest way to take that step.
And obviously secularism's on the rise, atheism's always increasing. People, I think you refer to them as the nons in America, people who define themselves as non-religious. And I was just wondering, has this led to an increase of alternate sort of support groups that have removed the God element themselves? Are there sort of atheist and secular organisations now picking up the mantle and offering support to people who are irreligious or just not interested in invoking God in their recovery?
Well, there are specifically secular organizations within AA. So later this month, I'm going to be speaking in Ontario, Canada, at an AA meeting, a large AA conference for a secular AA group. So there definitely are more of these groups popping up. The problem is when a group starts to deviate too far from the core AA message or any of the other 12 steps, they often are kind of cast out by the central organization, and they're often not considered true AA meetings, and so they won't be in the meeting lists, and it's harder for people to find them. There are a couple other alternates to the 12-step approach, and they're mostly secular, but the focus is not so much on just a secular version of the 12 steps. It's a completely different program that just kind of poo-poos the whole 12-step approach in general. One of those, for example, is smart recovery. And some people find that very helpful, but I thought there was enough wisdom in the 12 steps, in the original 12 steps, that, I could keep the basic outline of it and just give it a little twist.
Sure. So one of the 12 steps as well, which I suppose may becomes the most difficult to a lot of people, is this idea of righting wrongs and speaking to people you may have harmed.
Sure.
And trying to make amends. And it kind of seems like an obvious thing to do, but maybe you could just explain why that kind of thing's necessary and why that could be helpful for recovery, and what sort of form does that take? Are we talking face-to-face? Are we talking an email, a phone call, a quick sorry note, a bouquet of flowers? How would you focus on accomplishing that step?
Okay, that's a big question. So the 9th step is really important because the reason that we tend to engage in these addictive behaviors is because of some sort of baggage, some sort of emotional or psychological baggage, either, guilt or shame or regret, and, strained relationships, lost friendships, things like that. So a big part of clearing all that out and just getting to a place where we have what they would call in AA the wreckage of our past cleared up, a lot of that is going to have to be done through relationships, going to people that we've harmed in the past and saying, look, I did X, Y, and Z. I want to make it right. How can I do that? How can I make it right? A common misconception is that the 9th step is just about saying you're sorry. And it's really not. It's about, it may sometimes be about saying sorry, but often it's about making the wrong right. And that may mean, if you stole a car, you're paying someone back for the value of that car. And yeah, it's a long process, obviously, depending on your history when you were getting drunk and high. It's a long, long process, and it can be painful, and it can sometimes be expensive. But when you're done, you have a clear conscience. You don't have that baggage anymore. You don't have that guilt. You can walk the earth knowing that you've made all the wrongs that you can right. And that's a really powerful experience. Most of the time, we encourage people to do this face to face. So go actually find the person face to face. Now, you don't sneak up on them and bombard them, but you contact them ahead of time, say, here's what's going on with me. I would like to make this wrong right with you. Are you open to that? And then sometimes they're going to say, I don't want to see your face ever again. Please lose my number. In which case, okay, you do that and you honor, you're doing this for yourself, but you don't want to cause more harm in doing it. So if someone doesn't want to talk to you or they don't want to receive your amends, that's fine. But for the most part, it should be done face to face. And if it can't, this is something that you kind of do on a case-by-case basis, and someone in the 12-step program would hopefully talk to their sponsor about that, the person who guides them through the steps, and they'll help them decide in each case what to do.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I really like about your book, and I think it's especially an important message in this, I want to be charitable, but this is sort of currency that victimhood seems to carry of late. It can be almost an identity for people, and you rightly acknowledge that there are circumstances beyond people's control that may inform their addiction problems and may have landed them there in the first place. But you kind of emphasize, I think, to paraphrase the way you said it, I think you said something about you're not asking people to accept blame for the situation they're in, but to try and accept responsibility for it. And I thought that was a really strong, empowering message. And I just wanted to get your take on how important it is to take personal responsibility for yourself in these matters.
It's so important, and it's such a important distinction to make. A lot of times if you tell somebody that they're in a victim mentality and that they need to take responsibility, they feel like you're discounting what they experienced, or you're saying that, no, you didn't experience something horrible, or what you experienced isn't that bad and you shouldn't be upset about it. And that's not the case at all. There's a balance between feeling like a perpetual victim, like I have no control over my life because someone did this to me and I will forever be broken. And there's something in between that and completely denying that something bad ever happened to you. There's a happy medium where you go, you know what, something bad happened to me. It made me more prone to do this and that. It put me in this position, but that person is no longer doing that to me right now. I'm no longer being victimized by that person or those people. So now I'm in charge of what happens next. So it's holding on to both of those things. It's holding on to, yes, this happened to me. I honor that this happened to me. It was not okay. It harmed me. But now what? Rather than just staying in the mentality of, this is my identity. I am a victim of X, Y, and Z, and that's what I am, and I will forever be broken.
How do you feel about the narrative surrounding the idea of a predisposition to addiction, maybe a family history? And you'll often hear people invoke genes, for instance, that may inform addiction. Where do you fall on this debate?
Oh, that's absolutely true. Yeah, there's almost certainly a genetic component. In fact, they've identified some genes that make people more prone to addiction. There's no one addiction gene, but there are definitely genes that make people more predisposed to it. It's a complicated thing. There are people who will experience, although I will say that I have yet to meet an addict of any variety who doesn't have a history of some family of origin, some serious family stuff, some serious trauma or loss or grief or emotional neglect or abuse, something like that happened early on in their life. So I think that's almost always a part of it. But there are some people who can experience those things as a child and not become addicts, and some people who will experience those things and become addicts. And so I think it's an interplay between environment and genes and other things.
Sure. It's I think mental health and genes is something that's becoming more and more understood all the time, and more things are established, and luckily more people I would think are reaching out help for these things, and obviously your book is contributing to that, Jeffrey. So I want to thank you for giving up your time for speaking to me. Is there anything else you wanted to get across to my listeners at all before I let you get back to your afternoon?
I just hope that this book helps people. I want people to know that even though God and the concept of a higher power, a supernatural being, often is pushed so much in 12-step programs, there is a way to get sober where you don't necessarily have to buy into anything supernatural. You don't have to believe anything that is not based in reality. And, for people who are struggling with addiction, for people who think they might be an addict, what I always say is just get really, really honest with yourself. Don't worry about labels. Don't worry about definitions. Don't worry about the definition of an addict. Just look at your relationship with the thing that you're doing, whether it's pornography, alcohol, food, narcotics, anything. Look at your relationship with it. Is it causing you harm? Are you able to completely control it on your own? If not, it may be a good idea to look at that and see about getting some help.
Some good info to end on there. And where can people find you on social media, or do you have a website you could point people towards at all?
I am on Facebook. I'm on Twitter as Jeff_MFT. And I'm also on Instagram as JeffMFT. You can find me on Facebook, and you can find me on my website, www.practicallysane.net.
I like that. I see what you did there. Very clever. Jeffrey, this has been great. Thank you very much for speaking about your own struggles with this and championing a more positive, secular alternative to the 12 steps as well.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Godless Spell Checker podcast. The podcast is a one-man operation produced in my spare time away from my day job, and I love making it for you. If you enjoy what you hear, please consider lending some support. The show is entirely listener supported. I don't sell anything, I don't run ads, and given the alternative and unpopular focus of my content, it's very unlikely to find a sponsor. So there are a number of ways you can support and chip in and help improve the show and give me more time to produce more content. You can become a patron supporter and pledge a monetary amount per month or per episode by visiting patreon.com/gspellchecker. If you can't lend monetary support right now, don't worry, there's other ways you can help the podcast too. You can share it on your various social media networks, or take a moment to leave a review wherever you listen to it. Your support is massively appreciated. Thank you. Think we've all learned something here today?